Hey, have you ever seen a police disciplinary hearing so wild that it went viral? So this one did. And it involves a Massachusetts state trooper, Michael Proctor, who led the investigation into a high-profile death and then found himself in a hot seat for a misconduct. So, like, basically, the proper that investigator, like, was a lead investigator in the death of a Boston police officer, John O'Keefe, and a case that crippled New England, but in a dramatic twist. So, like, the trusted trooper became the focus of a misconduct probe. And the state police trial board found that Proctor had shared confidential case information with civilians and even drank, so like beer while on duty before driving his cruiser. And most shockingly, so like that the Proctor's own text messages, so he sent vulgar, derogatory comments about the suspect, O'Keefe's girlfriend, Karen Reed, to multiple friends and a family, calling you a wreck job, and among other just wild remarks. And the idea that a homicide investigator may have compromised his own investigation flipped the power dynamic and fueled the public distrust. And to add the drama, so the timing of the Proctor's downfall raised the eyebrows. And Karen Reed's first trial just ended in a mistrial, so hung the jury, in the mid 2024. And despite Proctor's misconduct being known internally by then, so he wasn't immediately fired. He remained on full duty for a month, and only after his crude text just became public during that trial, so did the state police finally take action. So only after they produced his messages. And they suspended Proctor and then fired him in March 2025. And to some, so the delay looked like the department was dragging its feet until public pressure just mounted, as it usually happens. And was Proctor being scapegoated to save his face after just a botched trial? Perhaps he was aware that it's where it's going. I mean, he was aware that it's not going to end it well, and like the question that was the breast covering up until they couldn't just anymore. But such questions just ignited suspicions of a cover-up and institutional CLY. And fast forward to August 2025, so Proctor basically appealed his firing. So he was trying to appeal it to make sure that that was a wrong decision. So like forcing the police department to reconsider it and leading to just unusually public civil service commission that kind of hearing. And that became a spectacle. And over multiple days, lawyers rehearsed Proctor's just behavior in great detail. So like viral videos clips from the hearings just to show jaw-dropping moments from that very state police own attorney that was calling Proctor's actions disgusting. And to Proctor himself being confronted with a vulgar text and a gotcha piece of evidence that just ultimately sank his case. And it's a kind of real-life legal drama, so you can't look away from. And in this breakdown, so like we will walk through the pivotal moments of the Proctor's hearing and trial, so explaining the legal twists and why they matter. And by the end, you will see how a high-profile case of the alleged police misconduct turned into just a roller coaster of accountability and what it means for justice and the public trust. So let's dive in. First of all, so right out the gate, the state police just made it clear that they weren't just defending their former trooper. And in the hearing opening statement, state police attorney Stephen Kerley unloaded on Proctor's with an unusually just blunt description, so citing Proctor's own words. And it was a federal hearing, so most of those blatant messages so were just hidden and not produced. But Kerley said Proctor's conduct was distasteful, unprofessional, inappropriate, in a poor taste, so juvenile, sexist, disgusting, and dehumanizing. And those words came from Proctor himself, like an act of acknowledgement of how bad his behavior was. And Kerley emphasized that this wasn't the critics or media talking, but the Proctor's own accounting of his actions. And in other words, even Proctor admitted that he acted way out of line. And the hearing such a blistering language from a police department, so like from that kind of lawyer about one of their own was striking, and it signaled that the agency had a flip side. And instead of just closing ranks, they were holding proctors accountable. Like Kerley also noted that the state police internal trial board had already found the Proctor guilty of just unsatisfactory performance for multiple violations. They were making a paper trail, and specifically, so Proctor had been caught leaking confidential case details to civilians and drinking alcohol on duty, and then driving his cruiser, like on top of sending those nasty texts. And the message was clear that no one is above the rules, and the Proctor's behavior was indefensible. And legally, so this opening served to establish so like just cause for firing Proctor. And the Kerley's job was to prove that the termination was warranted by Proctor's misconduct. And by using Proctor's own admitted descriptions and the findings of the trial board, so Kerley painted a picture of a trooper who breached the trust placed on him. And for the public, it was a powerful moment of accountability, like a police agency openly lambasting an officer for disgusting behavior. And many viewers were startled, and in a good way, just to see enforcement calling out of their own in such stark remarks and terms. And this scathing opening also set a tone for everything to come. So it told the audience, like both the commissioner and the public, that the Proctor's actions were beyond the pale. And if you were watching just the live stream or clips, you might have thought, so like, wow, it's own just department is saying this. So how bad must be the evidence be? And basically, they're not producing all the evidence. They are hiding, and they are still not able to produce it to avoid those that kind of shame. And as we will see, so the evidence was pretty bad indeed. And next, to understand just how unprofessional Proctor's conduct was, so we need to look at the texts that were started it all, and his text and his investigation, everything started with a bias in the open. So the central drama of both, so like the trial and the hearing, revolved around Proctor's text messages. So they were not involved regarding the specific investigation details or anything that he was able to produce, but about his own conduct. So like these weren't just any text, so they were crude, sexist, and shocking messages that Proctor sent during the murder investigation, and talking about the suspect Karen Reed. And during Rhodes' first trial in 2024, so Proctor had to read those messages just aloud on the witness stand and in front of a jury. And if that sounds is unusual and embarrassing, so it was. And those trial clips were replayed at the hearing to remind everyone of exactly what was said. So what did Proctor write that was so egregious? And in one group chat with a friend just after officers go give death, so like everybody asked Proctor if the suspect Reed was attractive, and Proctor responded, she is a whack job cunt. So yes, she is a babe, and weird Fall River accent though, and no ass. And in another text, he mocked Rick's chronic illness, like alcohol disease, so with a crude comment about leaky body parts. And he also called her retarded and nutbag, and in the various messages, and that was a shame. And it didn't just stop at insult. So Proctor joked about looking for nude photos for Karen on her confiscated phone and texting a colleague. So funny. So like I'm going through his exploitative client's phone. So like no nudes so far, and I hate that man. So I truly hate him. And he later clarified that the client meant to read that man, so reference to one of the Reed's defense lawyers. And in short, so Proctor's private messages read like rantings of just a teenage bully, not a professional homicide investigator. And when this text came to light, Proctor was humiliated and on the stand. So he concealed the remarks were unprofessional and regrettable, even apologizing to the jury for his language. But however, he simultaneously downplayed their impact and arguing that these juvenile comments had zero impact on the facts and the evidence and the integrity of his investigation. And in other words, so like, sure, I talk trash, but I still did my job correctly. And the Proctor maintained that, however, just across his jokes were, and they didn't just compromise the case. And from a legal standpoint, Proctor's texts were defense attorney's dream and the prosecutor's nightmare. So they suggested that a lead investigator might have been biased or not taking a case seriously. And Alan Jackson's Karen Reed's defense lawyer argued that the Proctor's derogatory attitude could have tainted the investigation and raising reasonable doubts about its fairness. And indeed, so one juror from the first trial later said that those messages played a part in their deliberations, like contributing to the hung jury, so mistrial outcome. And publicly, so the whole SAG wrote a trust in the law enforcement. And if a lead detective is calling the suspect awful slurs and then joking about your body, so how can he be just a public? So like, how public can be so confident in that investigation integrity? And perhaps, so like, most importantly, so the exposure of these messages to show that private communications aren't just always private. And the Proctor never expected that his broadshot to be displayed in a court or blasted on the internet. But because this was a high-profile case and everything became evidence, so it's a stark lesson that digital footprints last. And for people in positions of trust, of duty misconduct can come back just to haunt you. And the Proctors learned that the hard way. And the airing of his text was the key reason. So his hearing attracted so much attention. So basically, once everything began, like that retrial went, they were, the defense attorney was cross-examining that with a bombshell, like objecting with objectifying, like during the Karen Reed's trial, after prosecutors had the Proctor's reads his texts, so defense attorney Alan Jackson cut him to turn to cross-examine the trooper, and like what followed was a masterclass in exposing bias, as Jackson zeroed on the score issue. So like Proctor's lack of objectivity, and in a memorable exchange, Jackson asked pointedly, "Have you ever looked for naked photos of a male suspect that you were investigated?" And this question hung in the courtroom air, and it highlighted the absurd double standard in the Proctor's behavior. And he was effectively sexualizing and mocking a female suspect in a way no professional would consider with a male suspect. But Proctor stamped so that he doesn't look for nudes of anyone during the investigation, and calling his text an inappropriate joke. But the damage was done, and Jackson's question was just made it clear that Proctor's conduct was not only unprofessional but driven by bias. And Jackson didn't stop there, so he walked the troopers through admission and after admission, and the Proctors agreed that he had called Reed a retarded, just a whack job, etc., and each time tried to minimize it as a poor language. And Jackson shot back that poor language was just one way to put it, like completely offensive. It was another, and he pressed to do these messages reflect an objective investigator, and the Proctor just could only insist that his poor jokes and unprofessional language have no bearing on the integrity and facts of that case, and that Jackson's effort, like he retorted in essence, like was, so you weren't being objective, so you were objectifying And he suggested that the Proctor had made him just to his mind early, and then only looked for evidence to fit his theory. And this cross-exam bombshell, just a moment, was a hit online. So like views cheered that Jackson held Proctor fit to fire. And it's often just like you see a law enforcement officer grilled so intensely about a bias. And have you ever looked for neck photos of a male suspect? So like that line became a viral, such as a soundbite and success summary of how off base Proctor's behavior was, and it's resonated because it spoke to fairness. So we expect cops to investigate objectively, so not just be clouded by personal prejudice or just prurient curiosity. And even investigators cracking crude jokes about that person. So they are trying to, they are supposed to investigate, and how can we trust so like their words that they were objectively investigating? And Jackson hammered so the point, and in doing so he voiced so what a lot of observers were thinking. And from the hearing perspective, so replaying this trial exchange served to remind the Civil Service Commission just how badly Proctor's had undermined the appearance of impartiality and the police officer credibility in their accuracy. And Jackson showed that the Proctor had spent all of this. So the spectacle of his cross-examination also just reinforced a broader lesson. So bias in the policing he has consequences. And not only can it just derail a specific case, so we are just a mistrial or acquittal, so but when exposed, it undermines the public trust in the system as a whole. And Massachusetts State Police Colonel just like John Munn and later Colonel John E. Noble acknowledged that the Proctor's conduct compromised a large portion of the public trust in their agency. And the cross-exam was a turning point that led that bear for all to see. And the defense was basically like claiming that there were no policy and no crime. And it was a valid point because despite the damning text and the testimony, so Michael Proctor did not just roll over the accept and accept his fate, and at least so not initially, and he fought back through his attorney, so like Daniel the Moynihan, so like who put forth a defense that can be summarized as something. So like the whole thing is overblown, and the Proctor is being scapegoated. So, like the Moniak strategy was twofold. Like first, minimize misconduct and argue that it didn't just actually affect the investigation's outcome, and the second, like to exploit any just technical loopholes, like claim that the Proctor didn't violate any just rules or laws, and that was so absurd that he later even withdrew so his appeal. And during the hearing, so like Moynihan came out just swinging in his opening statement, and he painted Proctor as a very good trooper and just exemplary just trooper who had been made a scapegoat because of the state police like caved into the public pressure and the highly publicized trial. So and in the Moynihan's telling, so the department needed someone to blame for the embarrassing mistrial and the public outcry, and Proctor became the fall guy. And this hints at the possible truth. So like the timing of the Proctor's firing coming only after the trial fiasco, and that suggests that the state police acted under duress from negative publicity, and Moynihan so like harped on that, so like implying that the punishment was driven by politics and not fairness. And most notably, so the Moynihan just argued a sort of no harm, no foul defense, and he claimed that while Proctor's texts were distasteful, so there were no evidence that compromised investigation or a case against the Reed. And in fact, so Moynihan asserted that the Proctors broke no specific rules, Michael Proctor did not commit a crime. Michael Proctor did not violate a specific policy prohibiting a personal conduct or a personal phone, and because there is no specific policy, so this was a bold, as some would say, brazen technical argument, and essentially, if the rule book didn't explicitly ban that kind of behavior, so you can fire him. You can't just fire him for it. And to be fair, Moynihan had a point that the state police had no written policy at the time, specifically about off-duty texts on a personal phone, and Proctor was off the clock, venting in a private chat. And is it wise or ethical? Maybe no, but he was claiming that is it justifiable offense? So if no rules say so, that was the gray area that Moynihan just tried to exploit. But he contended that at most Proctor just deserved a slap on the wrist and a letter of reprimand, not a termination. And he even noted that Proctor's superiors initially seemed to agree. Proctor had self-reported the attacks to his bosses in early 2024, and he was told it might just result in a minor discipline. And only after the July 2024, after that mistrial the witch hunt for Michael Proctor began. And as Moynihan just phrased it, as this insinuates that Proctor's firing was more about appeasing outraged media and public and salvaging a case reputation than about attacks themselves. And no one is arguing that the public reaction to Moynihan defense, however, was largely negative. So, many observers felt that no policy, no poll, that claim just missed the forest for the trees. And just because something insists explicitly just a ban doesn't just make it okay explicitly for an officer of the law. And the state police attorneys contributed that this by stating the obvious. So, the department code of conduct doesn't just apply to behavior even of duty, and it doesn't matter. So if it occurs by mail, smoke signal, and clearly then retorted. So misconduct is a misconduct, and in other words, you shouldn't need a written rule that says don't call a suspect cunt in the text, and the common sense and the basic professionalism just covers it. And moreover, Proctor was found to have violated several existing policies, like the rule against the conduct unbecoming and against drinking on the duty. So it wasn't just the truth that he broke no rules at all. And legally, so Moynihan's arguments raised a worthwhile question. So how far can or should an agency go in punishing a person of duty conduct? And it's debate about the boundaries of professionalism, responsibility. But given the extreme nature of Proctor's behavior and its impact on the high-stakes trial, so the consequences, even among many just law enforcement folks, was that firing was appropriate. And in the end, so Moynihan's techniques defense was overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the Proctor's misdeeds and what happened next in the case. And every text leaves a trace. That was the kind of a bombshell evidence, basically. And apparently, so everybody whoever texted, called, or made eye contact with Proctor now has a lawyer on retainer. So at this point, so the only people not lawyering up are the ones still waiting. So for their just retainer to be cleared up and for the consultation fee just to clear. And just when the Proctor's hearing seemed like it might drag on with she said hearsay arguments, bombshell pills of evidence dropped. And in October 2025, so while the appeal hearing was on the brink, prosecutors made a stunning disclosure in related court filings. They had extracted data from a Proctor's personal cell phone, and the whole was enormous. So how enormous? So the extraction yielded hundreds of thousands of items, like text, images, and etc. So some dating all that the way back to 2013. And And this was far more data than anyone could have expected, and including just apparently Proctor's own lawyer. And why was this such a big deal? So recall that the Proctor's team had implied that all their messages were likely gone. So like Proctor's lawyer suggested messages to auto-delete over time. So only recent texts would be available. And that basically turned out to be a dead wrong. So the forensic extraction dug up decades worth of materials, and prosecutors even noted the volume was unexpectedly larger than representations of a Proctor's counsel regarding the cell phone. And in a basic, so like in a plain English, it looks like what Proctor's or his attorneys thought, like, or led others to believe, was on a form severely so underestimated reality, and there could be a whole trove of undisclosed conversations and potentially just revealing patterns of bias, misconduct, or just other problematic behavior by proctors on other cases, which they later were trying to prosecute, like the integrity and how they were like investigated. And the immediate impact was dramatic. So, like a state police union, which had been funding Proctor's legal fight, withdrew all support upon learning what was just found on the phone. And the union's executive board unanimously voted to sever the ties with the Proctor's appeal. So, like calling this a deeply embarrassing chapter in the state police history. And when even your union normally, so your staunch defender, so bails on you, it's a game over. And indeed, so it was game over for Proctor's appeal, like facing the prospect of his mountain of digital evidence and being used against him in the hearing. And the Proctor abruptly withdrew his appeal just to get his job back. And in mid-October 2025, so like just days before the hearing was to resume, Proctor signed a one-line statement ending the case. So like, I exercise my right to withdraw my appeal of my own free will. And with that, so the civil commission dismissed the matter, and Michael Proctor fight for reinstatement was over. So he effectively surrendered. And for many observers, so this twist was the final confirmation that accountability had caught up with the Proctor. And as Karen Reed's attorney Alan Jackson put it in afterwards, so like Michael Proctor's sudden withdrawal of his appeal wasn't an act of humility, and it was a self-preservation. So he learned investigators had recovered text messages from his private phone dating back years, and he wanted no part of that, of what just those messages would reveal. And he didn't accept accountability, so he hunted him down. And Jackson, just my drop quote, went viral too. So like, because it's so perfectly summarized. So the end game, Proctor didn't just suddenly see the light. He saw the evidence and ran. And this bombshell also just has wider implications. So if Proctor's phone contained that much data, it could affect other cases he worked on. And in fact, prosecutors and defense attorneys in at least 19 other cases, most of them murder cases, the Proctor helped investigate, are reviewing the materials for a sign of a bias, misconduct, and one of those cases involves Brian Welsh, and accused of murdering his wife in 2023, and Walsh's lawyers have been given just access to Proctor's text, so they subpoenaed it, and essentially so because he was the lead investigator on that case too. And in short, so the Proctor scandal might trigger a domino effect, so like reopening or complicating numerous cases, and it underscores sobering reality. So when a law enforcement officer is compromised, so it can cast a shadow over years of justice work, and the whole system became undermined just because of that kind of misconduct. And the lesson from the phone saga is clear. So like, every text leaves a trace. In today's digital age, so like, almost nothing is truly erased. And Proctor's attempt to downplay his misconduct collapsed under the weight of a hard data. And in obtaining the data, so the system demonstrated a form of a self-correction, so like albeit, and the truth found a way out. And once it did, Proctor would no longer just maintain his innocence or a victim narrative. And Accountability followed next, like it was the aftermath and the fallout. And with the Proctor's appeal ended, so the focus shifted to what happens now. And the immediate outcome was the Proctor's remained fired, and he's ousted from a Massachusetts State Police. He is impermanent, and given the notoriety of the case, so it's unlikely that he will work in law enforcement again. And the Civil Service Commission never had to formally rule on his case because the Proctor quit before they could, but it's safe to say that the evidence was stacked heavily against him. So that's the reason he wasn't running. So because it was like his decision. So he was forced. And Karen Reed, so the woman he investigated, ultimately had her day in court as well. So in June 2025 retrial, with the Proctors notably just not testifying, so the second time around, and Reed was acquitted of a murder, and the jury found her not guilty of just intentionally killing John O'Keefe, and she was convinced on a later charge of OUI, like operating under the influence, so related to the same incident, because he was also drunk. And the resolution of that case, combined with the Proctor debate, with his debacle, left many in the public wondering, so if Reed had been right, so all along, in claiming she was framed or at least not fairly treated. And her attorneys had argued that authorities rushed to judgment and perhaps even covered evidence or in O'Keefe's death. And the exposure of Proctor's misconduct gave those arguments a much more weight, at least in the court of public opinion. And the public reaction to Proctor's fall was largely a mix of vindication and outrage. And vindication that problematic officer was held accountable, and outrage that it took so long. So many saw Proctor's firing and the hearing as justified if overdue. And the phrase "so no one is above the law" was echoed in a commentary. And community members and activists who had followed the case felt that finally their voices were heard, and it was their pressure. So via social media, independent journalists, and relentless scrutiny that kept the spotlight on the case and likely just prompted state police to act decisively. And indeed, so the state police union president explicitly cited their embarrassment to the agency in pulling support from a Proctor, and public scrutiny so essentially forced the agency's hand. And within the Massachusetts State Police leadership and within that kind of acknowledge, so the damage done. And the interim state police colonel Cole Noble reportedly admitted that the issues exposed by the Reed O'Keefe's case and the Proctor's misconduct were systematic and had festered for years. And there's that remarkable statement, just a top cop conceding that this wasn't just a bad trooper, but indicate of deeper problems. And since then, so the agency has made noises about reforms and restoring the integrity. And Cole Nobles and others have said, though, rebuilding public trust is now a top priority, and they implemented changes like a stricter oversight of officer conduct and emphasizing so that personal conduct can affect one's job. And in time will tell that, how far those reforms go. But the fact, they're talking about systematic issues, like means and conversations that has just shifted from a Roger officer to the culture that impeded him. And one more significant repercussion is noted that defense attorneys in 18 plus cases involving Proctor have been altered to potential issues. And the Norfolk County DA's office had to review all Proctor's related evidence. So DOJ was trying to scrutinize, if anything exploratory or conceding needed to be handled over in those cases. And we might see appeals or motions in those cases as a lawyer sits and just Proctor's communications for for signs of a bias or misconduct. And this kind of a ripple effect is rare, and it underscores how a single officer's action can impact many lives and the legal outcome. And it's both scary and reassuring. So, like, scary is that it went unchecked for so long, but reassuring that once exposed, so the system is revisiting past convictions to ensure fairness. And at the very end, the Trooper Proctor saga just became a cautionary tale and a cautionary success story for accountability. And it demonstrates the power of transparency and persistence. And if not for the viral trial clips, so the public outcry and the media coverage, so everything makes it possible that the Proctor's behavior might have been swept under the rug, with a quiet reprimand. And instead, because people paid attention and demanded answers, a spotlight stayed on the case until action was taken. And sunlight proved to be the best disinfectant here. And before we conclude, let's distill a few key lessons from the whole roller coaster. What are the key takeaways from the Proctor's hearing? First of all, that every message can matter. Digital footprints are harder to erase than you just think. And the Proctor's private text messages, public evidence, and the forensic analysts recovered years of data. He assumed were gone, and whether you're a cop or not, so assume that what you write could someday see the light. The same goes with employment litigation. So everything may be scrutinized nowadays. So nothing can be just hidden or erased permanently. And the second thing, any bias has consequences. And the Proctor's derogatory attitude toward the suspect wasn't just trash talk. So it bled into the investigation or at least just undermined its credibility. And his bias-proof ammunition for the defense and shattered trust. And as Colonel Noble just conceded that such misconduct damaged the public trust in the whole system. And fair investigators, those require objectivity, and if investigator is can't remain a professional, so the case and the justice can derail. And the phrase something like not illegal equals acceptable, a major part of the Proctor's defense was there was no specific rule against what they did, no policy written, but they didn't just fly. So professionals are held to standards that go beyond the bare minimum for the law. Just because something isn't just explicitly outlawed in a manual just doesn't mean it won't just get you in trouble. And departments would be wise to update their policies to cover modern issues like digital conduct. But even absent a written rule, common ethics still apply. And of course, the driven effort that was just pushing everything forward was a public scrutiny, because it's a powerful mechanism. This case illustrates that the impact of public pressure, and the state police only took decisive action after the Proctor's behavior was exposed in the open court and the public reacted with an outrage. So had people not been paying attention, the Proctor might still be on the job and the shine line. We are in media, social platforms, or concerned citizens. Forced an accountability process that otherwise just might have not happened. And it's a reminder that engaged communities can hold institutions accountable. And what began as a tragic death of a police officer spiraled into a far-reaching scandal about the police misconduct and the transparency. And the Michael Proctor's hearing gave the public a rare inside look at how law enforcement agency deals with one of its own, who went way off a course. So it was messy, it was contentious, and it was all times unbelievable. But ultimately, it was accountability in action. And the state trooper who acted inappropriately was exposed and removed. And the suspect he investigated got a fairer just a shake in the court in the second time around. And the police force involved was was punished just to do some soul searching about its culture and policies. And this saga also reinforced so why oversight and open justice processes are so important. And if we hadn't seen a Proctor just reading his text on a stand, and if the hearing hadn't been public, so if a journalist hadn't just dodgedly just reported each development, that outcome might have been very different. And instead, so because the spotlight stayed on, the system course corrected, and it's not a perfect ending. So no one likes to see a corrupt investigation or a trooper's career and in a disgrace, but it's a meaningful one. So like wrongs were confronted and not swept under the rug, which is happened in most of the cases. And in the end, so like the Triple Proctor, just a story matters not just for Massachusetts, but everywhere. So it's a case study. So in why professional integrity, transparency, and public trust are inseparable in the justice system, and for every officer just out there. So it's a warning conduct that just unbecoming can and will end your career, and for every citizen. So it's a reminder that that just you should keep asking questions and demanding the truth. So like it makes a difference, and accountability is so one out there, and that's something to take heart in. And this process was long and convoluted, but it showed that with enough sunlight, even the most entrenched public problems can be brought to light. And once the light, so like they can be dealt with. So like one deeply embarrassing chapter at a time.